That's a very interesting question, and there's evidence for both the carrot and the stick process for trying to influence physicians who speak up in unfavorable directions. And we have actually from the quote Merck neutralized memos during the discovery process for Vioxx evidence that Merck actually had in writing in their internal memos in which, using their words, how do you quote neutralize, unquote, quote problem physicians, unquote, those who had favorable, unfavorable, stated opinions about their drug or favored a competitor's drug. Excuse me. And some of the sort of more benign carrot mechanisms involved giving them speakerships and offering them grants and so forth, essentially, trying to buy them off, which shows that at least the drug companies already believe that giving grants and so forth influences physician belief and behavior. But there's also evidence for less favorable approaches. So, for example, there was a person who later actually became head of the American Diabetes Association who had presented evidence some years ago suggesting that a diabetes drug, Avandia, that much later came out as potentially causing problems like heart failure. He presented data back in the late 1990s suggesting that this drug and a related drug class might cause such problems, and he received calls from executives in drug companies essentially implying to him that he could be personally liable for $4 billion in lost market capitalization for the drug as a consequence of his scurrilous remarks, and also called his dean and tried to put pressure on his dean to put pressure on him. Now, obviously, this is an empty threat. If the market and stock for a drug goes down, if the person who made those remarks were responsible for the money, that would mean that anybody who said favorable remarks that subsequently led to an increase in market should gain the positive side, which obviously doesn't happen. But still, that would be a very frightening phone call to receive. And another investigator from France who saw my name tag at a heart association meeting approached me and asked if I had been the author of an article in Annals of Internal Medicine on low cholesterol and violence. And he said, do you still have funding? He had been the lead author on, I'll protect his privacy and won't say what the study was, but on a study that had shown a large-scale epidemiological study showing that low cholesterol was linked to increased suicide risk. And he had an unrestricted career development award yanked from him as a consequence of having published that. A researcher that I'm in communication with who's studying, one class of adverse effects of these drugs received a very small grant from her own university to do laboratory tests associated with this. And somebody else from her university who has strong drug company conflicts actually put pressure on the university to yank that from her. There was a researcher who gave a talk, a researcher from a European country that I won't specify because I haven't been given permission by him to share the story, but who had presented some information that was unflattering to this class of drugs. And I actually approached him after his talk and asked if he'd had received any pushback from this. And he said that he had received a call from a vice president of one of the major drug companies telling him that if he persisted in presenting this kind of information, they would sue him, that their lawyers were bigger and badder than his lawyers, and that if he persisted and that even if he won the case, it would destroy him financially. And he did something far more savvy than I would have had the brains to do. He said, I've been taping your call and will pass your threat on to my lawyer at the end of the call. I don't know if that's legal in the country he's in, and I didn't ask if he actually did that or if he was just smart enough to say it, because I don't want to know, but it was either way, it was a very smart thing for him to do. And I actually was taken aside by a researcher who had shown untoward effects of lowering cholesterol in an animal model. He took me aside after a talk he gave when I was at UCLA because he thought I should know that they had the chair of his department had gotten a call from a vice president of one of the major drug companies telling him it would be, quote, unquote, at least as represented by him to me, quote, dangerous for them to continue to pursue this line of research. So there are these, examples of apparent pushback by industry. You're right. They have a lot of money on the line. And perhaps it's unreasonable to suppose that you can both have a publicly traded company where on the one hand there's a perceived obligation to stockholders and simultaneously expect them to have patient best interests at heart. The two are sort of fundamentally incompatible.
That is the basic crux of the problem. I mean, these are corporations whose sole commitment is really not towards the public health, but towards the bottom line of that corporation. And through science evolves and develops, and we learn more and more. But what many people don't appreciate is the amazing science. It truly is a science of marketing, and they've been able to really carefully identify the way to modify, mold, and impress upon a large percentage of, if not the vast majority of the professional community, and how to change and modify their positions on these important topics.
And, you could argue that, to the degree that their stockholders are their obligation, that if you or I were put in charge of those companies, and it was our job to improve the bottom line, we too would be putting into place all of these multiple strategies toward improving market share for our drug.
Mm-hmm. That's true. But I'm not sure all of them, because there really do seem to be some really significant ethical breaches in many of the scenarios you described. So,
well, I think there are very serious problems associated with them, and again, it's this expectation that you can somehow manage the duality of interests, with the one being, the stockholder and the profit line, and keeping the company alive and vibrant, and the other being the best interest of the patient. And perhaps the assumption that these two are compatible needs to be reexamined.
Well, and I think ultimately the public needs to know that, and many of the details that you've highlighted in this conversation really aren't typically or commonly known. And if the end consumer in this is the public, I mean, they're the ones who essentially are going to be the consumer of the drugs in question. Obviously, the physicians are the facilitators of that, but ultimately, if there's a significant consumer resistance because they are educated, they understand that yes, there are certain times when these drugs are going to be beneficial, but it's far less than the drug companies would have you believe, and that there's all these other variables that contribute to misinforming them. And if they can understand that and make an informed decision, then they can vote with their economic pocketbook and choose to refuse that drug.
Right.
So I think that's the key, and that's really what our commitment is, to educate consumers primarily of these specifics. And I really thank you for all you've uncovered and all you've done to help elaborate on the real challenge that we have in this system.
Well, you're welcome.
All right. Well, so we'll, we definitely would like to facilitate and help, as I said earlier, that transition to these impartial and objective advisory committees that I think that really have their expertise grounded in more of the epidemiological and neutral objective science than conflicted of interest. But thank you for all you've done, and the best of luck to you in your continued research.
Well, thank you very much for your time and interest.